Have you ever felt entirely, completely unseen in a crowded room, like you're practically a ghost? It is, man, it's one of the most universal and yet deeply isolating pains that we can carry from our youth. Welcome to this explainer. Today we are going on a really profound journey together to uncover the hidden psychological mechanics of survival. And by that, I mean the deeply ingrained ways our young nervous systems learn to adapt, to deflect, and to protect us when we feel profoundly unsafe or invisible. We're going to take our time and explore the brutal architecture of adolescent social hierarchies, and ultimately, the beautiful path to personal transformation. We're looking at a deeply moving collection of sources today that analyze the lived experience of the overlooked kid, the class clown, the late bloomer. It's really a story about what it actually takes to survive growing up, and how we can finally, truly heal the wounds left behind.
Okay, let's dive into this by completely reframing how we look at childhood behavior. We usually see the class clown, you know the one, the kid turning every single classroom into a stage, disrupting the lesson, cracking the jokes. We see them as a nuisance, right? Just a disruption. But the research tells us something entirely different, and honestly, it's heartbreaking. What if that disruptive behavior isn't an attempt to be annoying at all, but a desperate bid for connection? What if, for a kid who feels completely invisible, chaotic attention feels far more honest and real than the curriculum? This behavior, as we'll see, is very often a trauma response. When a child feels profoundly unsafe or unseen, their nervous system literally wires them to do whatever it takes to simply exist in the room. They aren't trying to derail the class. They are screaming to the world, "I am here, please, somebody just see me."
So here is our roadmap of the hidden adolescent experience. We're going to navigate this together through 4 distinct chapters. First, we'll examine the class clown's armor. Second, we'll map out the architecture of social invisibility. Third, we'll look at the threat of transformation. And finally, we will explore healing the inner child. Let's get started.
Chapter 1. The Class Clown's Armor. Survival over Humor.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the profound duality it represents. I want to ask you to look past the punchlines for a moment. We need to actually understand the kid who is exhausting themselves day in and day out simply because they are terrified of being ignored or exposed. The jokes? They were never really about being funny. They were armor. It's a carefully constructed, constantly maintained, and absolutely exhausting suit of armor to wear every single day. Think about it. Humor acts as an incredibly effective defensive shield. If a teacher is laughing, well, she isn't calling on you to read a paragraph you might struggle with. If the room is completely distracted by your antics, no one is noticing your undiagnosed learning challenges, your social anxiety, or the total chaos you might be dealing with at home. It is, quite frankly, a brilliant survival tool that is just masquerading as misbehavior.
When we actually break down the anatomy of this disruption, we see these much deeper, hidden motivations. Trauma and chronic stress, they teach kids that vulnerability is incredibly dangerous, like life-threateningly dangerous. So what do? They win approval to avoid rejection. Because if people are laughing with you, they aren't attacking you. They also learn to control the emotional tone of an unpredictable room. If they are the one making the joke, setting the volume, owning the energy, no one else can catch them off guard and hurt them. And sometimes this disruption is literally masking a highly gifted, creative mind that is just utterly crippled by boredom. High intelligence very often masks itself as chaos in understimulating environments, turning a really bright student into an accidental saboteur. But wearing this untouchable mask, it carries a massive heavy cost. Over time, it leads to profound emotional numbness and a terrifying identity confusion. The child is left lying awake at night wondering, who am I if I am not the funny one? They start to realize they are loved for the performance, not for themselves, which creates this incredibly deep loneliness, even when they're standing right in the middle of a crowded room.
So the crucial point here is that not all class clowns are the exact same. When we read into the specific hidden hardships each type carries beneath the laughter, a really tragic picture emerges from the research. Let's look at these. Those stuck in the class clown role feel immense, crushing pressure to constantly perform, to keep that mask up at all costs. Over time, this chronic performance leads to significantly lower life satisfaction, a trend that often stretches well into their adulthood. Then you have the comic talent. Now, they might actually achieve genuine social popularity, but they face a super high risk of utilizing that talent specifically to mask deep, painful psychological issues. Nobody checks in on the funny kid, right? Next is the disruptive rule breaker. They face constant, escalating conflict with teachers, which naturally drives lower academic achievement and just pushes them further and further to the margins of the school system. And finally, the subversive joker. They engage in thrill-seeking, prank-driven behavior that inevitably leads to severe peer conflict and heavy systemic discipline. The raw material in literally all of these kids is a dynamic, highly capable personality, but the role they were forced to adopt to survive just becomes a rigid trap.
Chapter 2. Architecture of Social Invisibility. Let's look at the system itself.
Now that we understand the individual mask, we really need to zoom out and unpack the broader system. Why does a child with incredible emotional depth, fierce loyalty, and amazing humor get pushed to the absolute bottom of the adolescent hierarchy? Well, this comparison right here perfectly illustrates the specific, localized tragedy of the late bloomer. Just look at the massive disconnect. Kids in middle school and early high school, they operate on very primitive, survival-based social instincts. It's practically Lord of the Flies. They value rigid status, outward appearance, forced confidence, and incredibly strict group approval. But the late bloomer, they often already possess the exact qualities that mature adults cherish: profound emotional depth, true kindness, loyalty, genuine humor, and deep sensitivity. The extremely painful reality we have to face is that their weight or their awkwardness didn't make them unlovable. It made them invisible. They were surrounded by children who simply lacked the emotional maturity and the intelligence to recognize their immense worth. They had the absolute right traits, just the entirely wrong audience.
The actual everyday mechanics of being unseen in this system are just brutal. Early on, based entirely on surface traits. Maybe they struggled with their weight, or maybe they just weren't great at sports. A kid gets placed into a permanent low-status category. And once that label is applied, it's like a psychological filter drops over the entire peer group. Everything this kid does from that point on is interpreted negatively. If they try to join in a game, they're annoying. If they tell a joke, it's immediately labeled cringe. And here is a vital reframing we need to talk about. Girls in this specific environment didn't explicitly reject this boy because he was inherently unlovable or flawed. They were responding to a systematic hierarchy that dictates who is socially approved. This boy was filtered out before he ever even reached the starting line. He was blocked by an unforgiving system of pure gatekeeping. Girls simply lacked the social permission to choose him, because choosing a low-status boy meant risking their own deeply precarious social standing in a really ruthless environment.
Chapter 3. The Threat of Transformation. What happens when the inner and outer finally align?
But then, for some of these kids, a really profound shift occurs. This is that intense era, usually somewhere in high school, where internal identity and external presence finally begin to align. And let me tell you, it causes a massive disruption to the established social order. There's this poignant memory detailed in our sources that perfectly captures this moment. It's called the Blue Polo Awakening. It's a beautifully honest, raw memory of a middle school boy struggling heavily with his weight, putting on a blue polo shirt, looking in the mirror and just sucking in his gut, because he thought just for a second he looked like a model. Now, it is absolutely crucial that we treat this memory with total dignity. This was not delusion. This was not some silly vanity. This was a vital, life-saving spark of self-recognition. For a kid who had been mocked and ignored by the entire world around him, this was the very first time he saw a clean silhouette, a tiny spark of confidence. It was a genuine glimpse of the man he was going to become. His physical body hadn't actually transformed yet, but his deep inner intuition saw the truth. He looked in that mirror and his soul said, "There is something in me that is beautiful."
Your glow-up didn't create your worth. It revealed it. I really want to pause here for a second and let that heavy emotional truth settle. Your glow-up did not create your worth. It revealed it. By junior year of high school, this exact same boy wore a blue polo to a county fair, and suddenly everyone thought he looked amazing. So why the massive difference? What changed? Because the outer appearance had finally, at long last, caught up with his immense inner potential. He had grown fit, his face had matured, his posture fundamentally changed. People weren't reacting to a magic spell, and they certainly weren't reacting to a shirt. They were reacting to a beautifully grounded, suddenly visible presence. They were seeing a young man who was completely comfortable in his own skin, exuding a quiet, profound strength. They were reacting to a boy who was finally aligned with who he was always meant to be.
And this brilliantly illustrates why this beautiful transformation almost always triggers such a vicious backlash. The adolescent social hierarchy absolutely despises when someone jumps tiers. Suddenly, this former low-status kid was physically strong, he was attractive, he was deeply empathetic from years of observation, and highly charismatic. And let me tell you, this combination was intensely terrifying to the insecure boys who had relied entirely on him staying beneath them.
You see, the bully's self-worth was a house of cards, utterly dependent on someone else being at the absolute bottom. Since they couldn't beat this newly transformed boy physically or morally anymore, they weaponized the only thing they had left: social control over girls. They reacted with calculated sabotage, intense mocking behind his back, and aggressive gatekeeping, trying to block his access and actively undermine any of his attempts to connect. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to trap him in his old, invisible identity so they didn't have to confront their own glaring insecurities. Think about that. He wasn't kept away from girls because he was undesirable. He was kept away because he was becoming entirely too desirable, too powerfully himself, and the system simply couldn't handle the threat.
Chapter 4. Healing the Inner Child. How we finally integrate the past.
So what do we do with all this? How exactly do we integrate this complex, painful past and truly heal the deep wounds inflicted by such a cruel system? Well, the sources provide a remarkably clear, grounded and actionable roadmap for emotional repair, based really heavily on the psychology of attachment. We need to walk through these 4 steps very, very intentionally. First, you must explicitly acknowledge what that inner child lived through. Do not downplay it, do not brush it off. Acknowledge the profound isolation and the sheer exhaustion of keeping that mask up. It was real and it deeply hurt. Second, you must give him the validation he never received at the time. You have to look back and tell him you were trying your best. You absolutely deserve kindness. You deserve to be seen. Third, let the adult you take over the job. That kid had to survive loneliness and protect himself all alone in the dark for years. The adult you must step in now, take the reins and say, you don't have to carry this heavy armor anymore. You can rest. I'm strong enough now. I'm here. And finally, you must rebuild the story. You have to actively rewrite the narrative from I am unlovable and unwanted to the actual, undeniable truth. I was just misunderstood by a broken, primitive system that punishes sensitivity.
I want to conclude our explainer today with this incredibly powerful, provocative thought from the research. If you take away absolutely anything from these slides we've looked at today, please let it be this: you weren't unwanted, you were unprotected. Wow. When you really realize that you were never the problem, but rather the environment around you was broken and failing you, it fundamentally shifts how you view your entire history. Your inner child didn't need to become wanted by the world back then. He needs to become wanted by you right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and please take really good care of those hidden histories within you.